Neat Nation, welcome to Whiskey and, a new venture from the Droopy Whiskey channel where I'm talking about whiskey today, specifically this one, and something, specifically today, coffee. The point of Whiskey and is to infuse some other stuff into the whiskey. Not that whiskey itself is lacking, far from that, but whiskey's adjacent to many other joys in life. So we're going to use Whiskey and to talk about culinary products, media, movies, music, radio, 8-tracks, Braille, literature, Russian ballet, you name it. Point of this show is to just share some whiskey, drop a review, and then talk about something that's rattling around in my brain, do a little dishing. I have no idea how I'm almost out of this E.H. Taylor. I've left it in the tube, and it's clear that somebody has been stealing my whiskey. Not the first time, probably won't be the last. Maybe my 6-year-old son, maybe my wife, maybe my friends during whiskey night. Probably the last one is most likely. Let's start Whiskey and by tasting this. This is E.H. Taylor. This is Buffalo Trace. That's what this is. It's 100 proof. It's bottled in bond. Has to be bottled in bond. It's E.H. Taylor, right? I mean, if we're going to talk about E.H. Taylor, we're going to talk about bottled in bond. Relative to Buffalo Trace products, like Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare, I find E.H. Taylor generally is leaning on the spicier side. Eagle Rare, I get mallow and mellow oak, some cherry. Buffalo Trace itself, I get like a peachiness, and it's about as nondescript as it gets. It's delicious, but it's like honey, and that's about it. It's not very spicy, but we get into H. Taylor, and it is a little spicy. Nose is still pretty dang mellow. But the glass itself carries a viscosity that's nice. The body's not too thin. Packs a little more than the standard 90 proof Buffalo Trace. We do have 10 more proof points here. And while you still get maybe some stone fruit, maybe reminiscent to a plum, you still get a very honey kind of sweetness, maybe some agave. You pack them with that some baking spices, maybe a touch of nutmeg. Nothing too harsh like a cinnamon. Maybe some white pepper, not full black pepper on the finish, but you get kind of a peppery on the back there. I'd say let's call that white pepper. I do like that plummy fruit call out too. It's not as bright and red as, a cherry, but there's something there, a little pruniness, but without pronounced oak. There's not a lot of pronounced oak in this particular product. I'd like to see more. It's definitely evident in the E.H. Taylor barrel proof, and often in the single barrel, so you get a little more age. Not so much here. This to me is a spicier Buffalo Trace, which I dig. It's not an everyday whiskey for me. I'm not super jacked to get into it, but I enjoy it when I pour it. MSRP on this used to be $40, and it's definitely worth $40. I'm gonna buy at $40. That said, you almost never see it anymore, and the standard small batch generally is going to run you about $60. If you like it, it's probably okay at $60. I'm not rushing to stock up on it at $60. So if you do see it closer to that old MSRP at $40, which is probably still the MSRP knowing Buffalo Trace, don't hesitate. But $60 is probably the limit for me. I'm out after that. Our secondary topic today is coffee. The and to the whiskey and is coffee. Why? Well, I know coffee. I work coffee. You could say that I'm a coffee pro, meaning that I work in coffee. My job is to direct development. I'm the development director at Stone Creek Coffee in Milwaukee. It's a rad gig. A lot of fun for sure. I performed a lot of roles there, and I've basically learned how to run a coffee company from start to finish. And it's a lot of fun, and there's a lot the world doesn't know about coffee. So we could take this a lot of directions. But I'm going to assume if you're watching this video, you're primarily a whiskey geek, but you're interested in coffee. You're coffee curious. Well, I'm here to support that curiosity. But we're going to keep it elementary, rudimentary. We're going to keep it fundamental here. And my goal in this particular episode is just to share some thoughts on how to brew coffee better. Because a lot of us, when we wake up in the morning, we need coffee. We need it injected to our veins. We want that caffeine, a bit of a caffeine dependency, and our body has come to expect it. So you wake up in the morning, and that hot fluid too, I think it nourishes the soul a little bit. There's something deeply spiritual about that morning cup of coffee. But a lot of us, we're not getting everything out of it we could. We're leaving stuff in that brewing process that we probably want to pull out of it. In some cases, maybe we're pulling too much out of the brewing process, and either way ending up with coffee that's subpar relative to what it could be. So, a couple things I want to call out here if you want to have great coffee in the morning. Well, number one, you need to start with good beans. You can't make good coffee out of crap beans. And there's a lot of crap beans out there. And there's a lot of fine beans too. Let's say you're a Dunkin' Donuts person. You like to get the Dunkin' Dark Roast, which is fine. Let me tell you, that's fine. But to coffee, that's like Evan Williams Black Label. It's fine. It could be a lot worse, but you're leaving a lot on the table. We're not talking about Elijah Craig 12. Wouldn't you rather have the Elijah Craig 12 of coffee in the morning? Well, if you're like me, yes you would. But we all have to make these judgment calls. Now, I will caution you against stuff like Folgers, Maxwell House, like that is coffee for sure, in the same way that Kessler's is whiskey. So, if you're a whiskey geek, you like fine whiskey, just know that there's a whole other world in coffee that you're just barely scratching the surface of. In the words of C.S. Lewis, I'm pretty sure it was C.S. Lewis, maybe it was Chesterton, you could be like a child making mud pies in a slum and happy in doing so because you're unaware of what the joys of what a vacation at the beach would look like. So if you're just living your life enjoying Folgers and Maxwell House, I challenge you to look up specialty coffee in the Google and learn what coffee can be. So, I'm ranting and raving like a lunatic at this point, but the challenge is get good coffee. Stone Creek Coffee, that's company where I'm at, my company. We have a lot of stuff that's really engineered to meet you at the point in your journey where you are in coffee. Light roasts, medium, dark roasts, specialty light roasts we call small batch coffees, and then like uber high-end coffees we call reserve. So if you're like, Drew, I'd love to try your coffee, what should I get? Hit me up in the comments below, or you can DM me on Instagram at DrewPWhiskey, and I'm going to steer you right. I can even get you a discount if you want. Just use the code WHISKEY15 at checkout at StoneCreekCoffee.com, and hey, we're going to get you some good coffee for sure. Once you have that good coffee, which you could also get good coffee from Quills, which is my boy Brian Bikey at Abandoned Bourbon, good guy. For sure, good coffee down there at Quills. They're based out of Louisville. And then our good friend Kyle Ramage, friend of the show, has been on here, swell guy. His company, Black and White Roasters, out of Raleigh, North Carolina, also great stuff. So, get yourself some good beans, and then you need to invest in your brewing process. And by invest, I mean take care. Let's just start there. There's a couple variables you need to control once you have good coffee to pull all the right things out of that coffee. You ready for these? Okay. Number one is the water you're going to use for brewing. Okay. You need good, filtered, high quality water. By high quality, I mean good filtered water. So if you've got a filter like in your fridge, maybe a Brita / Pure filter thing, it's a solid place to start. What's an okay option is to get a big thing of purified drinking water from the grocery store. That's actually really, really good for brewing, generally speaking. Another option is to get distilled water, which basically has nothing in it. That's not good for brewing. You need some stuff. You need some stuff in your water, but you can get packets from a company called Third Wave Coffee to add to your distilled water to create the perfect water for brewing. For now, let's just get you running filtered water. Don't pull it from the tap. Get yourself some good filtered water and that's going to help your brew. Then make sure that that water is really, really hot. So if you're using just an average coffee pot, like many of us do, it's probably worth running a little bit of a test, running a brew cycle, and sticking your meat thermometer into your brew basket, the basket where the coffee grounds sit during your brew cycle, and seeing what the temperature of the brew slurry is in the middle of your brew. If it's anywhere below 190, which is very common, you're probably not pulling enough good stuff out of your coffee. So you want to make sure you have a brewer that gets the water nice and hot for the brew cycle. So you need good purified water, filtered, and you want it nice and hot. The next variable, equally important to the water, which water is really important because it makes up 98.5% of your ultimate beverage. So you want to start with good water. You don't have good water, you don't have good coffee. But the next thing, equally important, is the grind size of your beans. I've seen a lot of people buy coffee pre-ground. That's actually not a bad idea if you're getting it from a place that will grind it right for you and grind it for the brew method you have. We do this at Stone Creek Coffee, and I don't know about Quills and Black and White, but I would say, this is maybe a hot take, but it's better to buy coffee ground properly than to buy whole bean coffee and then grind it poorly before you brew. I've seen a lot of people, it's very common, who have cheap coffee grinders that have a blade in them that when you turn that grinder on and the blade just spins and whacks the coffee and beats it into a bunch of different sized particles. That's not good. That's not good, because when water hits those coffee particles, it's extracting the smaller particles at a heavier rate than it is the larger particles, so you're having an uneven brew. That's not good. It doesn't make good eats, doesn't make good coffee, doesn't make good sips. What you want is what's called a burr grinder, which doesn't just smash the beans, it actually grinds them for a fuller, richer, more satisfying flavor profile. These do cost more than blade grinders for sure, but you can get reasonably priced burr grinders, and if you're a coffee geek, it's worth the investment for sure. Because if you've got your water and you've got your grind dialed in, your coffee's going to pop in ways that you never imagined. Like you've been thinking, I've just been drinking coffee on mute for all these years. You didn't need to do that. The other variables that you need to be mindful of after you've dealt with your water and your grind size, couple real quick, we'll go through them. And you want to make sure you're using the right amount of coffee beans to match your water. Very common brew size, like brew batch that people are working with, is somewhere around 24 ounces. They're trying to get 3 mugs-ish, basically full. For that amount of brewed coffee, you need to use roughly 1.5 ounces, somewhere in the range of 50 grams of coffee to produce that. If you're used to using the spoon method, the tablespoon, and you're doing scoops into your brew basket, you're going to be surprised how many scoops that is. Odds are pretty good that you've not been using enough coffee in your brew. That does mean you're going to spend a little bit more money in coffee, but again, we're talking about the joy of drinking coffee, like getting the most out of the coffee, not necessarily spending the least. If you want to spend the least in coffee, yeah, get Folgers. You'll live a life of limited joy. If you want to extract the most joy out of your coffee, your morning, and your life, maybe consider updosing the amount of coffee that's going into your brew. You might say, well, I don't like it strong. Well, listen, your coffee might taste strong and bitter, not because you're using too much coffee, but either because it's ground too fine or because you're using a super dark roast that's just conveying lots of carbon into your morning cup. And so you're trying to mellow that carbon out by using less coffee, and then you end up with a watered down, bitter, carbonic coffee versus a nice, full, sweet, rich, fruity brew once you've dialed in your water and your grind size. Once you've handled all of that, your grind size, your water, your coffee to water ratio, which... So before we move on, your coffee to water ratio needs to be 1 part coffee to 15 parts water. You do that by weight. You should do it by weight. I mean, if you're talking about making a repeatable brew, it's kind of scientific. You need to make it repeatable, and you need to measure by weight, not by volume, because coffee varies greatly in volume. Dark roasts tend to be bigger, take up more volume than light roast. There's a lot I can get into, but bottom line is weigh your water, weigh your coffee. And once you've handled all of these variables, you just need to make sure you're using the right grind size to match your brew method. Like if you're using a flat bottom filter, whether it's a drip brewer or a manual brewer, and that brewer comes to a flat bottom, so the filter's in there but it's flat, you want to use generally a slightly coarser grind. If you're using a cone-shaped brewer of any kind, particularly one with a large drip area where the water flows through quickly, you want to use a fairly fine grind size. You're using a French press, you want basically rocks. You want a really coarse grind size, and you want to agitate it really, really well. By agitate, I mean stir in the middle of your brew. If you're looking for resources on how to use your particular brewer and how to get the most out of it, hit me up. I'll send you links depending on what you're looking for. You can also go to stonecreekcoffee.com and go to the Learning tab where we have some really handy brew guides for you. This is not really meant to be a Stone Creek Coffee commercial. It just happened that way. So use those tips, and I think you're going to start getting more out of your coffee for sure. One other thing I'd say about coffee, particularly related to whiskey, is hot coffee and whiskey generally don't mix very well. I'm not an Irish coffee guy. I don't like it. I feel like it ruins the bourbon and ruins the coffee together. That said, you can make some pretty rad bourbon cocktails, particularly with bourbon coffee cocktails, particularly with cold brew, like really concentrated coffee and cold coffee, and then sweeten the snot out of it. So you need like the addition of sugar, and you want to use a concentrated coffee. I feel like the heat just, again, doesn't do the bourbon justice and doesn't taste very good. You can make a really, really killer virgin cocktail too with a really concentrated cold brew, and then like a honey or maple syrup with some maraschino cherries, a little bit of bitters. Yeah, it's simple, but it's good. We're actually doing something very similar to that. We're making an old-fashioned syrup in our cafes that people will be able to have in cold brew form, latte form, or even like the frozen frappuccino bait things, kind of things. Yeah, you'll be able to get that with a special barrel-aged honey, bourbon cherry, bitter concoction that we've made up. I'm pretty stoked for. Hopefully you enjoyed this inaugural episode of Whiskey and the Coffee Edition. I do recommend E.H. Taylor at the right price point for sure, and I recommend that you invest in your coffee. I don't think you'll be sorry. I think it'll be a journey worth taking, particularly if you're starting to get tired of bourbon. Not that you would, not that you should, but coffee's a journey for sure. Lots more to come there. I feel like we could do like 8 episodes, 18, 80 episodes on coffee. I'll spare you. We'll start with 1. And we'll see what crosses my brain next week. Cheers, y'all. Keep it neat.